What if intelligent people do not disappear because they hate people? What if they disappear because they finally notice something about human behavior they can no longer ignore? From the outside, it can look cold. One day, they reply less. They stop joining conversations that used to feel normal. They become harder to reach. They no longer explain why they need space. And people start creating their own story. They must think they are better now. They must not care anymore. They must have changed. But sometimes, what looks like disappearing from the outside is not rejection. It is recognition. Something inside them has started seeing the difference between being surrounded and being understood. For a long time, they may have accepted every conversation as connection, every message as closeness, every laugh as loyalty, every familiar person as someone who belonged in their life. But intelligence, when it becomes self-awareness, begins to notice what repetition reveals. It starts hearing the pattern behind the friendly voice. It starts feeling the gap between someone's presence and their actual care. Here are the first reasons intelligent people slowly disappear from everyone's life. Reason 1. They start noticing patterns they used to ignore. At first, people look the same. The friend still smiles. The message still sounds casual. The compliment still sounds kind. The room still looks normal. But then the small details begin to line up. They notice who only appears when they need something. They notice who is present for their problems, but strangely absent for their good news. They notice the apology that returns often, while the behavior never changes. They notice the joke that keeps landing in the same painful place. None of these things may seem dramatic by themselves, but an intelligent mind remembers. It connects one moment to another. It begins to understand that behavior repeated over time is usually more honest than words spoken in the moment. And once they see the pattern, they cannot pretend it is only a coincidence. This is where distance begins, not because they suddenly stop caring, but because they stop ignoring what has been asking for their attention all along. Reason 2. They stop confusing attention with real connection. Attention can feel like closeness when you have not yet learned the difference. Someone may text you often and still not know your inner world. Someone may spend time with you and still only care about the version of you that is useful to them. Someone may say they miss you, but only miss the access they used to have. Intelligent people begin to feel that difference. They stop asking, "Who is around me?" They start asking, "Who actually understands me when I am not performing?" And once that question becomes clear, some relationships naturally begin to fade. Not because they were fake from the beginning, but because they were never deep enough to survive honesty. And once intelligent people stop mistaking attention for connection, the noise they use to tolerate begins to feel much heavier. Reason 3. Shallow conversations begin to drain them. At some point, intelligent people stop being entertained by the conversations that once helped them feel included. The gossip starts sounding the same. The complaints keep circling the same wound. The jokes become a way to avoid saying anything real. And a room full of people can begin to feel strangely empty, not because no one is speaking, but because almost nothing honest is being said. This is often misunderstood as arrogance. People assume they think they are too smart for everyone, but that is not what is happening. They are not looking for perfect people. They are looking for something real enough to meet them where their mind actually lives. A conversation does not need to be serious to matter. It only needs to feel like someone is actually there with them, not just waiting for their turn to speak. A little curiosity in the eyes, a little honesty behind the answer, a sense that the conversation is moving towards something real instead of circling the surface. Without that, the interaction begins to feel like noise wearing the costume of connection. And after enough noise, distance starts to feel less like rejection and more like relief. Reason 4. They become more selective with emotional energy. Intelligent people eventually learn that access has a cost. Every message they answer takes something. Every problem they absorb takes something. Every relationship that requires them to shrink, perform, explain, or overgive takes something. For a long time, they may keep showing up anyway. They may answer because they do not want to seem rude. They may listen because they know what it feels like to be unheard. They may give access to people who have never learned how to handle it with care. But self-awareness slowly changes the way they measure connection. They begin to ask whether this exchange is mutual or whether they are only being used as a place for someone else's chaos to land. They start noticing which people leave them calm and which people leave them scattered. They notice who respects their silence and who treats it like an inconvenience. That is when selectiveness begins. They are not doing it to punish anyone. They are doing it because they finally understand that their energy needs a door, and not everyone deserves a key. Reason 5. They no longer feel guilty for needing space. This can take years to learn, especially for people who were used to being available. They may feel guilty for not replying quickly, guilty for not explaining their mood, guilty for needing silence before they can return with honesty. But eventually, they understand that space is not cruelty. Space is where their mind becomes clear again. It is where they separate their real feelings from the expectations placed on them. It is where they stop carrying emotions that were handed to them simply because they were available enough to receive them. It is where they remember that being kind does not mean being constantly reachable. If one of these first 5 reasons already feels familiar, comment the number that describes you most. I want to know which one made you pause. But the deeper reason intelligent people disappear is not only exhaustion, it is what they begin to see in people once their self-awareness becomes sharper. Reason 6. They stop taking everything personally. This is one of the quietest changes that happens when intelligent people begin to disappear. They start realizing that not every reaction is a verdict on who they are. Not every cold reply means they failed. Not every silence means they did something wrong. Not every mood in the room belongs to them. For years, they may have absorbed these things automatically. Someone seemed distant, and they searched themselves for the mistake. Someone was irritated, and they wondered how to fix the atmosphere. Someone misunderstood them, and they felt responsible for repairing the entire story. But self-awareness begins to interrupt that old reflex. They learn that other people bring entire histories into the room before a single word is spoken. Their fears, their disappointments, their private pressure, their unspoken needs. This does not mean intelligent people excuse everything. It means they stop swallowing every reaction as if it belongs to them. They can care about someone's feelings without making themselves responsible for every feeling that appears. And once they understand that, they no longer need to carry every mood they encounter. Reason 7. They recognize insecurity behind behavior. At first, this can feel painful, because once you see insecurity clearly, certain relationships never look the same again. The person who always corrects you may not be wiser. They may be afraid of not being needed. The person who interrupts you may not be confident. They may be uncomfortable sitting in a space they do not control. The person who constantly needs your attention may not love you deeply. They may simply fear being forgotten. An intelligent person begins to see the hidden emotion underneath the visible behavior. And that awareness changes the way they respond. They argue less. They explain less. They become less available for emotional games that used to pull them in. Not because they are becoming cruel, but because they can finally tell the difference between someone who needs understanding and someone who keeps using their pain as permission to hurt others. Reason 8. They stop trying to fix people who do not want to change. This is where distance becomes necessary. For a long time, intelligent people may believe that if they explain better, love harder, stay longer, or become more patient, the other person will finally understand. So, they keep returning to the same conversations, the same apologies, the same promises that sound different but end in the same place. Then one day, something inside them becomes tired in a way rest cannot solve. They realize that insight cannot be forced into someone who is committed to staying unaware. And from that moment, they stop offering their energy to patterns that only know how to repeat. They do not leave because they hate the person. They leave because they finally understand that saving someone else cannot require losing themselves. And once they stop carrying emotional patterns that were never theirs to fix, silence begins to feel different. Reason 9. Solitude becomes a place of self-respect. This is where most people misunderstand intelligent people the most. They assume distance means loneliness. They assume silence means sadness. They assume a smaller circle means something went wrong. But for an intelligent person, solitude can become the first place where their mind finally feels unforced. They do not have to perform a role, maintain a version of themselves, or translate their inner world into something easier for others to accept. For the first time, there is enough space to notice what has been happening inside. They begin to hear the thoughts that were buried under years of noise. They notice what they actually want, not what everyone expected them to want. They feel which choices make them more honest, and which ones slowly pull them away from themselves. That kind of clarity can feel strange at first, almost too quiet, almost uncomfortable. Because when you are used to noise, peace can feel unfamiliar before it feels safe. But slowly, silence stops feeling like emptiness. It becomes the room where self-respect starts breathing again. They do not choose solitude because they have given up on people. They choose it because they are learning not to abandon themselves just to stay connected. Reason 10. They stop needing constant validation. For a long time, they may have measured themselves through other people's reactions. They watched their own worth rise and fall with every message that came in, every silence that stretched too long, every small sign that someone still wanted them in the room. Without realizing it, their identity may have been tied to staying acceptable to people who never asked whether that role was exhausting them. They kept performing closeness even when the connection had already gone quiet. But self-awareness begins to loosen that grip. They realize that approval can feel warm and still lead them away from themselves. They realize that fitting in can cost more than standing alone. They realize that being liked by everyone is not the same as being at peace with who they are becoming. So the old questions begin to change. Instead of asking, "How can I make them understand me?" they begin asking, "Does this life still reflect who I am?" Instead of asking, "Will they approve of this version of me?" they begin asking, "Can I respect myself if I keep pretending?" They begin choosing a quieter kind of belonging, one that does not require self-erasure. That is when their disappearance becomes less about people and more about alignment. They are not trying to become unreachable. They are trying to become honest. And when validation stops controlling them, their disappearance begins to reveal its final meaning. Reason 11. They build a life that no longer depends on approval. This is the part most people never see. They think an intelligent person disappeared suddenly because one message went unanswered, one gathering passed without them, and one quiet decision made them harder to reach. But most of the time, the distance was growing long before anyone noticed. It grew every time they had to shrink themselves to keep a connection alive. It grew every time they laughed at something that quietly hurt them. It grew every time they stayed available for people who only loved their access, not their actual presence. Then one day, they no longer had the energy to keep betraying themselves gently. So they stopped arguing with people who had already chosen not to understand. They stopped chasing friendships that only survived when they were useful. They stopped giving explanations to people who were never really listening. And without making an announcement, they began building a life that felt more honest from the inside. To everyone else, it looked like distance. But to them, it felt like finally standing in their own life without bending around everyone else's expectations. They could hear their own thoughts again. They could move at their own rhythm again. They could meet the version of themselves they kept leaving behind just to remain acceptable. This is why intelligent people can disappear from everyone's life and still feel more present than ever. They are not always lost. Sometimes, they are finally done being misplaced. And this is where all the reasons come together. The person who replies less may be called cold. The person who needs space may be called antisocial. The person who stops chasing may be called distant. The person who chooses silence may be called changed. But sometimes, these are not signs that someone stopped caring. Sometimes, they are signs that someone finally started listening to their own life. They realize that time is limited, energy is limited, attention is sacred, and the people around them quietly shape the person they become. So if you have been stepping back lately, ask yourself one honest question. Are you running away from people, or are you finally walking toward yourself? If this video gave language to something you have been feeling quietly, comment whether you have ever disappeared from someone's life, or whether someone has disappeared from yours. Subscribe to Awaken Psychology for more videos about mental strength, hidden psychology, self-awareness, and the parts of your mind that are waiting to be awakened.